Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. When you say America today, most people immediately think of the one and only global superpower. But here's the kicker. Before World War II, the US was the definition of isolationist. We didn't give a damn about running the world. So how did a country that wanted nothing to do with international drama become the most dominant force on the planet in just a few decades? That's what we're digging into today. Now, what exactly qualifies as a superpower? There's no official unchecklist or anything, but political scientists and historians generally agree on three core pillars. Number one, you need world-class military might that nobody can challenge. We're talking blue water navy, strategic bombers, nuclear deterrence, the whole nine yards. Number two, your economy has to be a global engine, the kind that drives trade, investment, and innovation everywhere, with a currency that everyone wants to hold. And number three, you have to be able to bend international politics to your will, set the rules of the game, shape global order, and make other nations adjust to you, whether they like it or not. If you roll the clock back to the early 1900s, only one country actually checked all three boxes: Great Britain. Back then, the British Empire ruled the waves with the most powerful navy on Earth. They could park battleships off any coastline on the planet, and their merchant marine carried goods from every continent. Colonies scattered across every time zone. That's why they bragged the sun never set on their flag. Between massive manufacturing exports, control over global shipping lanes like the Suez Canal, and a colonial network that extracted wealth from everywhere, rubber from Malaya, tea from Ceylon, diamonds from South Africa, spices from India. Britain wasn't just rich. They were the ones who dictated what international politics even meant. They could launch a punitive expedition anywhere, blockade any port, and force any government to heel. They were the original superpower, no question about it. Now, the United States back then, completely different animal. We were tucked away safely across the Atlantic, focused almost entirely on our own hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was our big foreign policy statement, and all it basically said was stay out of our backyard. Our standing army was tiny, fewer than 30,000 regulars, barely enough to chase down the remnants of the Plains tribes. Our navy was respectable, but nothing compared to Britain's Grand Fleet. We couldn't have cared less about European alliances, Balkan crises, or who sat on which throne in some old world capital. Global leadership wasn't even a phrase in our political vocabulary. We were happily minding our own business, expanding westward, building railroads, and getting rich off our own internal market. Why bother with Europe when we had an entire continent to ourselves? That all started to change in 1898, the Spanish-American War. At the time, pretty much every European observer wrote us off. Spain was an old colonial heavyweight with centuries of military tradition. They had fortifications in Cuba, experienced officers who'd fought in Africa, and overseas garrisons in the Philippines that had been there for generations. They figured they could handle these upstart Yankees without much trouble. But once the shooting started, the U.S. Navy and Army rolled over them like they were nothing on both sea and land. Admiral Dewey sailed into Manila Bay and destroyed the entire Spanish Pacific Squadron in a matter of hours, without losing a single ship. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charged up San Juan Hill, capturing the high ground and smashing Spanish resistance in Cuba. It took us just 6 weeks to crush what had been a 300-year-old empire. And when the dust settled, we walked away with the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and effective control over the Caribbean. We also annexed Hawaii outright, giving us a massive deep water base right in the middle of the Pacific. Pearl Harbor became our springboard to Asia. That war gave us coaling stations, naval bases, and territorial holdings thousands of miles from our shores, and suddenly we had a direct stake in Asian trade routes. That war sent a jolt through every chancellery in Europe, from London to Berlin to Paris. For the first time, the world realized the US wasn't just some regional backwater. We were building our own overseas empire, complete with bases, colonies, and a naval presence in both the Atlantic and Pacific. And here's what really scared them: our industrial and mobilization muscle. In the span of a few months, we expanded our army from fewer than 30,000 regulars to over 220,000 troops, equipped them with modern rifles and artillery, shipped them across the ocean on our own merchant vessels, and sustained them in combat in tropical conditions, all while running a peacetime economy that barely broke a sweat. The Europeans looked at that and thought, if these guys can do this so fast, with so little preparation, what happens when they really get serious, when they fully mobilize and put their whole industrial weight behind a war? That question haunted their military planners for the next 2 decades. But here's the thing, After that war, we didn't double down. We went right back to our old habits. Massive troop reductions. We demobilized almost as fast as WED mobilized. Warships mothballed or sold off international entanglements. No thanks. We slammed the door on European affairs again and stayed that way right up until 1917. When we finally entered World War I, for almost 20 years, we sat on the sidelines while Europe armed itself to the teeth, watched the alliance systems crystallize, and shrugged when the assassination in Sarajevo triggered a continent-wide bloodbath. We were happy to sell arms and food to both sides, but send our own boys to die in the trenches of France. Not until German U-boats started sinking our merchant ships and the Zimmermann telegram revealed Berlin was offering Mexico a deal to invade us. That got our attention when we finally joined the fight in 1917. Our active duty army was barely over 100,000 men. Smaller than most of the other major belligerents like France, Germany, or Russia. But within just 12 months, we carried out a nationwide mobilization that blew everyone's mind. The military swelled to over 4 million troops, 4 million, and we shipped a huge chunk of them across the U-boat-infested Atlantic straight into the trenches of France. That feat alone proved two things. First, American industry could mass produce everything from rifles to artillery shells to cargo ships at an insane pace. We built ships faster than German submarines could sink them, and second, we could move an army across an ocean and keep it supplied under wartime conditions. With our logistics network stretching from the Midwest all the way to the front lines, a logistical nightmare that we pulled off without collapsing. When the German spring offensive of 1918 ran out of steam and our fresh division started hitting the line, the Germans knew they were finished. Our arrival effectively broke the stalemate and forced the armistice. After World War I ended, President Wilson came forward with his famous 14 points and the idea of a League of Nations, a permanent international body where countries would hash out their differences, instead of going to war, a kind of global town hall backed by collective military action. Over 40 nations signed up early on, including Britain, France, Japan, and even China. It was the first real attempt at a global collective security system, and it had the potential to reshape international relations forever. But here's the great American irony. The guy who invented it, the United States, never actually joined. The Senate blocked it, led by isolationist Republicans like Henry Cabot Lodge, who insisted that joining the League would drag us into endless foreign quarrels and undermine our sovereignty. Isolationists roared in opposition, and we walked away from our own brainchild. We packed up our diplomatic bags and retreated back across the Atlantic, leaving the League to limp along without us, and limp it did, powerless to stop Italian aggression in Abyssinia, Japanese expansion in Manchuria, or Hitler's rearmament. In hindsight, many historians think our absence crippled the League from the start. Fast forward to 1939, World War II breaks out in Europe when Hitler invades Poland, and Britain and France declare war. And once again, our default setting was stay out. We passed neutrality acts that banned arms sales to belligerents, but we gradually amended them as the war progressed. We sent arms, ammunition, fuel, and food to the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, which Roosevelt famously compared to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. We provided destroyers to Britain in exchange for naval bases, and we even started escorting convoys halfway across the Atlantic. But we kept American uniforms off the front lines as long as we could. Public opinion was strongly against getting dragged into another European bloodbath, and we had plenty of isolationist sentiment right up to the very last moment. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. That single morning changed everything. Japan had been building its own Asian empire since the early 1930s, chewing up territory from Manchuria down to Southeast Asia, taking French Indochina, threatening the Dutch East Indies, and pushing toward the British colonies of Malaya and Singapore. They were butting heads directly with American interest in the Pacific, especially over oil, rubber, tin, and strategic shipping routes. We had imposed oil and steel embargoes on Japan, cutting off about 90% of their imported oil. And they were running out of options. Their gamble was simple. The Americans are soft. They hate casualties, and if we smash their Pacific fleet in one surprise blow at Pearl Harbor, they'll crawl to the negotiating table, lift the embargoes, and let us keep our conquests in Southeast Asia. They thought they could present us with a fait accompli in wed fold, but Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of Japan's combined fleet, saw it differently. Head lived in the US for years, studied at Harvard, traveled the country from coast to coast, and understood Americans in a way most of his colleagues didn't. He knew our industrial base, the massive steel mills around Pittsburgh, the endless oil fields in Texas and California, the auto plants in Detroit that could be retooled overnight to build tanks and planes. He knew our population, diverse, competitive, and ferociously productive when motivated with a natural talent for engineering and improvisation. And he knew our national character, easygoing, individualistic, and slow to anger when we're not directly threatened, but absolutely relentless and unforgiving once we're attacked. His famous warning was that we were a sleeping giant and that waking us up would be a catastrophe for Japan. He predicted that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months to a year. But after that, American industrial power would overwhelm Japan completely. He turned out to be exactly right. After Pearl Harbor, the United States transformed overnight. Idle factories were reactivated and retooled for war production within weeks. The War Production Board coordinated everything from tank production to aircraft assembly to ammunition factories. Automobile assembly lines started cranking out tanks, armored vehicles, and trucks by the tens of thousands. Appliance manufacturers switched to making aircraft components, ammunition, fuses, and optical instruments for bomb sights and periscopes. Entirely new plants rose from empty fields, funded by billions in government contracts, staffed by millions of new workers, many of them women who'd never worked in heavy industry before. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon. With our homegrown abundance of coal from Appalachia, iron ore from Minnesota, oil from the Southwest, and timber from the Pacific Northwest, we built the most massive industrial war machine the world had ever seen. And it kept growing right through 1945. By the end of the war, we were producing more than 100,000 aircraft per year, 60,000 tanks, and 2 million military trucks. We were literally drowning the Axis in steel. At the same time, we mobilized our people. Every man, woman, and teenager got swept into the national effort. Young men volunteered or were drafted by the millions. We instituted the first peacetime draft in 1940 and expanded it massively after Pearl Harbor. Women flooded into factories, welding, riveting, operating, heavy machinery, driving cranes. Working in munitions plants, retirees took up civilian defense posts. They served as aircraft spotters, air raid wardens, and Red Cross volunteers. By 1941, total U.S. military personnel stood at roughly 1.4 million. By 1945, that number had exploded to over 12 million. More than 8 million of those in the Army alone, with over 3 million in the Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. That's not a mobilization, that's an avalanche. We were fielding divisions in Europe, North Africa, Italy, the Pacific Islands, and Southeast Asia, all simultaneously. Fighting on 2 separate fronts, thousands of miles apart, and doing it more effectively than any other country in history. And we didn't just throw bodies and bullets at the enemy. We poured enormous resources into scientific research. The Office of Scientific Research and Development funded work on radar, sonar proximity fuses, encryption, rocketry, and the most secret project of all, the Manhattan Project, which gave us the atomic bomb. We recruited brilliant scientists, many of them refugees from Europe, and concentrated them in secret labs at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. When we dropped those 2 weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, the world shifted on its axis. For the first time ever, one nation possessed a weapon capable of erasing entire cities with a single strike, killing 100,000 people in an instant, and ending a war without a single American soldier setting foot on Japanese soil. That was the moment the United States stopped being a great power and became the sole superpower in a league of its own. A country that had literally unlocked the power of the atom. Now, here's a critical point that often gets overlooked. After World War II ended, America didn't just win. We emerged almost completely unscathed. Our homeland infrastructure was intact. No bombing, no invasion, no occupation. Our cities were standing. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, all untouched. Our factories were humming at full capacity, producing not just weapons, but consumer goods, appliances, and cars that the rest of the world desperately needed. Our workforce was experienced, healthy, and hungry for peacetime production. Millions of veterans were returning home ready to work, buy houses, and start families. We had the highest standard of living in the world. Compare that to Europe. London was a patchwork of rubble blocks of flattened buildings, missing roofs, shattered glass everywhere. Berlin and Dresden were practically flattened. Firestorms had turned entire neighborhoods into ashes. With more than 50,000 dead in Dresden alone in one night of bombing, Rotterdam, Warsaw, Coventry, Hamburg. The list goes on. Industrial centers across the continent were gutted by years of strategic bombing and ground combat. Roads, bridges, rail networks shattered, blown up, or simply worn out. Millions of civilians were homeless or displaced, wandering the countryside in search of food and shelter. Entire economies had collapsed. Inflation was rampant. Currencies were worthless. And basic necessities like bread and coal were rationed severely, and Japan was even worse. The firebombing campaign that started in 1944, especially the massive low-altitude night attack on Tokyo in March of 1945, incinerated over 16 square miles of the most densely populated urban area on Earth, killed somewhere around 100,000 people, and destroyed more than 250,000 buildings. Then Hiroshima and Nagasaki got nuked, and the entire country was on its knees. Its cities in ruins, its navy sunk. Its army stranded across Asia, and its emperor preparing to surrender. So when the war ended in September of 1945, the US wasn't broke. We were booming. Gross domestic product had nearly doubled since 1940. Our economy was larger than Britain, France, Germany, Japan. And the Soviet Union combined industrial output was twice what it had been in 1939. Unemployment dropped to practically zero. Anyone who wanted a job could find one. And wages were rising. We had the largest gold reserves on Earth, about 60% of the world's total. And our dollar was backed by that gold, making it the most stable currency around. Our technology, from aviation to electronics to nuclear physics to medicine, was the envy of everyone. And we were the only country on the planet with nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. That's not just winning a war. That's winning the future. We owned the post-war world before it even started. But raw strength alone doesn't make you a superpower. You also have to decide what to do with it. Before World War II, we repeatedly chose to retreat from global commitments. After the Spanish-American War, after World War I, every time WWII pulled back. We flipped that switch permanently, and we did it for reasons that made both moral and practical sense. Wednesday's seen what happened when the League of Nations failed and aggression went unchecked. Millions died, entire countries were destroyed, and we ended up fighting an even bigger war. We were determined not to make that mistake again. We launched the Marshall Plan in 1947, pumping more than $13 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $150 billion today, into rebuilding Western Europe. We provided food, fuel, machinery, raw materials, and technical expertise to countries that had been devastated by war. We poured resources into Japan, rebuilt its infrastructure, reformed its constitution, and reoriented its economy toward peaceful trade and alliance with us. We extended economic and technical aid to developing countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Not out of pure charity, but to build partnerships, open markets, and push back against Soviet influence wherever it threatened to spread. We understood that stable, prosperous allies were better than poor, desperate ones that might turn to communism. We also took the lead in founding the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, institutions designed to promote global cooperation, stabilize currencies, and fund development. All with America sitting at the head of the table, providing the lion's share of the money and the diplomatic muscle. We formed NATO in 1949, the most powerful military alliance in history, a mutual defense pact that made clear that an attack on any member would be treated as an attack on all. And we ringed the globe with bases and security treaties. From South Korea to Germany to Turkey to Japan, more than 800 overseas bases at our peak. We became the undisputed leader of what mainstream media calls the free world. Not because we forced anyone, but because we built a system where our allies depended on us for their security and their economic recovery. And we depended on them for strategic depth and diplomatic legitimacy. It was a deal that benefited everyone. Of course, we weren't the only superpower to emerge from World War II. The Soviet Union rose right alongside us. Stalin's Red Army had rolled through Eastern Europe and installed communist governments all the way from Poland to Bulgaria, creating a massive buffer zone against future invasions. They had the largest army in Europe, enormous natural resources, and a ruthless willingness to sacrifice anything for victory. That split Europe into two hostile blocs, and the Cold War locked in place almost immediately. Decades of nuclear arms races, proxy wars, espionage, and ideological battle that dominated global politics. We raced them to space. They put up Sputnik, we put a man on the moon. We raced them to deeper oceans with submarines and nuclear missiles. We raced them to deadlier missiles, ICBMs, Michigan RVs, cruise missiles. We fought them in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other places through proxies and surrogates. It was a knife-edge struggle that defined global politics for nearly 50 years, with the constant threat of mutual nuclear annihilation hanging over everything. Then, in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. Not because we defeated them in a direct war, but because their economy couldn't keep up with our technological and military spending. Their system was inefficient, stagnant, and brittle. When Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform it with perestroika and glasnost, it unraveled instead. Russia inherited most of the nuclear arsenal and the conventional military hardware, but their overall national power took a brutal nosedive. The economy cratered, GDP dropped by more than 40% in the 1990s. Living standards plunged, life expectancy actually fell for Russian men. Their global reach shriveled. They lost their Eastern European satellites, their naval bases, their influence over former Soviet republics. In recent years, under Putin, they've clawed back some military and energy leverage. Their oil and gas exports give them a bit of clout in Europe. But they're still a long way from the Soviet peak, and since the Ukraine war kicked off in 2022, they've been bleeding manpower, equipment, and international credibility, emboldening NATO on one side, exposing Russian military weaknesses on the other, and getting bogged down in a grinding war of attrition that's draining their resources and their youth. So the question naturally comes up, will America lose its superpower status anytime soon? Honestly, I don't see it happening in the near term. As of 2026, we still field the most comprehensive military system ever built. 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, stealth bombers like the B-2 and the new B-21, the most advanced satellite network for surveillance and communication, special operations forces that can operate anywhere on the planet, cybersecurity units that are fighting a shadow war with China and Russia, and a global-based network that lets us strike anywhere within hours, not just with conventional bombs, but with hypersonic missiles and, if necessary, nuclear weapons. Our defense budget is bigger than the next 10 countries combined, and we spend billions on research and development to stay ahead of everyone else. Our economy, despite its problems, remains the most innovative and influential on Earth. The dollar is still the world's primary reserve currency. Every central bank in the world holds dollars, and international trade is largely settled in dollars. Our financial markets, Wall Street, the NASDAQ, still set the global pace. Our tech sector, Silicon Valley, Seattle, Austin, still drives global innovation in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, semiconductors, and space exploration. We have the best universities in the world: Harvard, Michigan T, Stanford, attracting the brightest minds from every country, many of whom stay and contribute to our economy and our research labs. We've got the infrastructure, the venture capital, and the risk-taking culture that keep pushing frontiers. Whether it's developing mRNA vaccines in record time or landing rockets on drone ships in the middle of the ocean. Now, I'm not blind to our internal issues. The federal debt is climbing past $30 trillion, and climbing fast. Fiscal deficits keep widening because we're spending more than we take in, and our entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare are on an unsustainable trajectory. Political polarization is worse than any time since the Civil War, with both parties digging into their trenches and treating each other as enemies rather than opponents. Gridlock in Congress, dysfunction in the executive branch, and a Supreme Court that's become another battleground. Social divisions over race class and ideology are getting sharper, not smoother. We're arguing over critical race theory, transgender rights, immigration, policing, and 100 other flashpoints. And the loudest voices on both sides tend to drown out the moderates. All of that is sapping our long-term resilience and making us look less stable, less predictable, and less credible to the rest of the world. But let's be clear about something. These are structural, long-term problems, decades in the making and decades in the solving. They're not going to knock us off the #1 spot next year or even in the next 10 years. Real power shifts are slow, grinding affairs, not overnight implosions. History doesn't change with a single election or a single recession. It changes when fundamental advantages erode over generations. When educational systems decay, when infrastructure crumbles, when demography turns against you, when competitors invest in their own futures and leapfrog ahead, that kind of shift takes 30, 40, 50 years to fully unfold. And even then, It's rarely a clean transfer from one hegemon to another. More often, it's a messy, chaotic transition with wars, economic crises, and a lot of suffering along the way. So for the foreseeable future, barring some black swan catastrophe like a civil war, a viral pandemic that escapes our control, or a complete financial meltdown, the United States will remain the global superpower. But I'd be a fool if I said we'll stay there forever. No nation in history has held the top spot indefinitely. The Romans had their run, almost 500 years as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. The Mongols had theirs, a brief but terrifying empire that stretched from China to Eastern Europe. The Spanish had their golden century when their treasure fleets brought silver from the Americas and their tercios dominated European battlefields. The Dutch had their moment as the financial center of the world, the British had their imperial century, and then every one of them eventually faced new competitors, new technologies, new forces they couldn't control. And every one of them eventually declined, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically. America is not immune to that law of history. The rise of a nation is never an accident. It's a combination of geography, resources, culture, timing, and leadership. We had all of those, a vast continent rich in natural resources, 2 oceans protecting us from invasion, a strong work ethic rooted in our immigrant heritage, a political system that was flexible and responsive, and leaders who, for the most part, made good strategic decisions at critical moments, and the decline, when it comes, doesn't happen overnight. It creeps in through bad decisions, eroded institutions, complacency, and overreach. Too many wars, too much debt, too much internal division, too little investment in the future. It happens when we stop fixing our problems and start pretending they don't exist, or when we turn on each other instead of working together. So the really interesting question isn't who will replace the US, it's what will the global order look like when the shift finally happens. A multipolar world with China, India, the EU, and maybe Brazil all balancing each other. A new coalition of regional powers that cooperate on trade but have their own military alliances. A breakdown of the whole nation-state system, replaced by something like a global confederation or a fragmented network of city-states and megacorporations. Nobody knows for sure, but one thing is certain, the next superpower, whoever they are, won't be a copy of America. They'll have their own strength, their own weaknesses, their own way of doing things, and they'll face their own challenges that we can't even imagine today. But that's the conversation we ought to be having. Not panicking about tomorrow, but thinking clearly about the next generation. Not chanting USA #1 mindlessly, but asking hard questions about what we need to do today to keep our edge tomorrow. Invest in education, rebuild our infrastructure, fix our healthcare system, reduce our debt, heal our political divisions, and compete in the technologies of the future, like AI, quantum computing, and clean energy. That's how you stay on top, not by resting on past glories. That's all for today. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. Tell me if you agree. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. Tell me what you'd add. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.